Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Carlos sent me a note and said, Steve, here's one you've never seen before. And he's right. A lot of people say that, but they're not always right. Carlos was right. Miami federal jury convicts dealership employee of carjacking customer in apparently what was supposed to be a repossession, but it went wrong. So Chris Gothner wrote this for local10.com down there in Miami. Man who worked at his family's South Florida car dealership could face more than a decade in federal prison after a jury convicted him of carjacking a customer. And that's from the U.S. Department of Justice making the announcement. Prosecutors said this whole ordeal began with an auto pay issue that caused the victim to miss a loan payment on a 2020 Honda Accord he had purchased from this dealership. The Miami federal jury convicted the man who was the guy from the dealership from Aventura, who's 58 years old. And the Department of Justice news release says that this is how it went down. The man worked for an auto sales company in Miramar. Now, interestingly, the business is listed on Google as permanently closed. Authorities said the victim is a 24-year-old man. He bought the car from that dealership in October of 2023, but was not given a copy of the sales paperwork he signed. So there's problem number one. When you leave the dealership with your car, you should have all your paperwork with you. In making the purchase, the victim understood he was paying a finance company. What the victim was not aware of was that there was an agreement between the finance company and the dealership that if the buyer was late on a payment within the first 2 months, then the finance company could demand the money it paid for the loan back from the dealership. So they're basically telling dealers, look, you better be selling these cars to people who can make payments. And just to make sure of that, if they miss one of their first two payments, we can actually call back the entire loan. So that's an interesting situation between the lender and the seller. But again, the buyer would not know this. Prosecutors continue that part of the agreement mattered because the victim's first payment bounced after he set up auto pay, with the victim paying the first installment late and with a late fee. But he did make the payment. Authorities said that because of that, though, the finance company sent the dealership a letter saying that the dealership needed to buy the loan back and owed them $13,000. So the man made the payment, so he's not in default. But the finance company still said, well, but we still consider that a default as between you, that is the seller, and us, because of that agreement we've got regarding the first two payments. So prosecutors said the carjacking occurred 5 days later, even though the victim was current on his account. And the dealership was expressly told they could not repossess the car. Nevertheless, authorities say that the man from the dealership followed the victim in a BMW near Miami International Airport. Prosecutors said when the victim reached a red light, the guy from the dealership, whom the victim had never met before, got out of the BMW in the middle of the intersection and approached the victim's Honda, ripping off the paper temporary tag and aggressively yelling at the victim to get out of the car. The victim was able to get away when the light turned green, but the salesperson eventually caught up to the victim at the Miami Tri-Rail Station, authorities said, and the salesperson or person in the dealership continued aggressively screaming for the victim to get out of the car. And again, that's a quote from the documents issued by the Justice Department. Continued aggressively screaming at the victim to get out of the car. Now, here is where it gets really, really intense. The guy from the dealership, the defendant here, lifted his shirt to reveal that he had a weapon in his waistband. So right there, you've introduced a whole new level of complication to this that's going to get really, really ugly when this gets to court. And it did get ugly when it went to court. So that led the victim to surrender the keys. Now, the victim called the police because he thought, I just got carjacked by an armed guy. So the police did arrest the man from the dealership, and the case later became federal because the feds stepped in and noted there were some federal statutes involved here. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago about a friend of mine who has a case where he achieved an $800,000 verdict against a dealership that had pulled one of those yo-yo sales, spot delivery, where they gave her the car after she gave them some money, and they later said, we need more money. And she said, no, that's not how this works. And they came and took her car, which they weren't allowed to do. And before you want to argue with that, understand that a jury agreed with the car buyer there and awarded a gigantic chunk of change against the dealership because what they did was wrong. And so the judgment was over $800,000. And so that case was in federal court because there's federal statutes addressing auto loans and so on. Now, there might be state case law and state statutes also. There might be. But the federal statutes and that stuff is pretty strong. So here, the feds got involved, went to federal court, federal jury came back and convicted this guy. So the defendant is scheduled to be sentenced in January. But according to the federal carjacking statute, he could spend up to 15 years behind bars. So one of the things I always want to make sure people understand this, because it'll help you understand what's happening if you buy a car where you take out a loan against the car. So let's assume that you go into a dealership to buy a car, new or used, and you don't have financing. Now, you can always go and get your own financing, like from a credit union. I know people who do that, and they love it, and it's great for them. And they'll even get pre-approved, so they can walk into a dealership and just go, I'm pre-approved for up to this much money. So I'm talking about where you go in and the dealership arranges it. If you read the documents you sign in most states, the documents you sign say that there's a dealer who is a seller and you, the consumer, a buyer. So think of the buyer and the seller. And there's a third party involved in this transaction who is the bank. I'm going to call them the bank, even though they might not be a bank. They might be a lending institution, or they might actually be the financial arm of a car company. So when you go in to buy the car and you say, I don't have financing, can you guys get me financing? They say, yes, we can. Obviously, nobody from the finance company ever comes into this transaction, sits down and talks to you and has you fill out. No, the dealership handles all of that. And so if you read the documents you sign, it'll say that you're buying a car from the dealer. The dealer is selling you a car. You promise to pay the dealer. The dealer is allowed to assign that to somebody else, the third party. And so let's suppose you went to the dealership and bought a Ford and you were financed through Ford Motor Credit. All the documents that you're filling out and are signing are Ford Motor Credit documents that were provided by Ford Motor Credit to the Ford dealer, and they were told you can use these documents as long as you follow our guidelines. And now they might call Ford Motor Credit to get an approval, which they most certainly will, but the point is that still there's nobody from FMCC in that room with you. It's you and the dealership personnel, right? This is important. So let's suppose you go to the dealership, you get approved, you sign a whole bunch of documents, and you leave with the car, and you're planning on making payments. So they take the paper, which is what they call this, they take the paper and they assign it, they assign the paper to the lender, the bank, whoever it is. Now they hold the loan. So you knew all along, you're not making payments to the dealership, you're making payments to the lender, the bank. However, if you read the documents, it'll say you're borrowing the money from the dealership. However, the dealership's got the right to assign the loan to a third party. If that assignment fails, which it can, then it reverts back to the dealership. And then theoretically, the dealership is holding the paper. And I've had clients before who've had a situation where they bought a vehicle from a dealership, the assignment failed, the dealership called them up and said, come bring your car back. Why? The bank rejected your loan. Okay. That's your problem, believe it or not. You can make payments to the dealership. And I know a lot of people are saying, but Steve, that sounds so unusual. I've advised my clients to do it, and they've done it. And I've also known other attorneys who have advised their clients to do it, and they do it. And what happens is after you make a few more payments to the dealership, they eventually find somebody else they can assign the paper to. But the point simply is, because this assignment fails does not mean that the sale falls apart. Two different transactions. They're all related to each other, but they're different transactions. So here, this guy bought a car from a dealership. He's driving the car. He sets up auto pay. It doesn't work for whatever reason. That first payment doesn't go through on time. The second he finds out about it, he takes care of it and straightens it out. However, The lender, being kind of nervous about these transactions, goes, we don't like this loan anymore. And apparently they've got a side deal with this dealership that says if we're not happy with the first 2 payments, we can give the deal back to you. And so instead of shopping that loan around to somebody else, they decide to repossess the collateral, which apparently they're not entitled to do because the guy was current when they grabbed the car. So it's unfortunate that these things happen. And you almost never hear about something this crazy happening with a big established car dealer. Now, interestingly, we do hear about spot deliveries and yo-yo sales happening with big established car dealers because some of them do that and they get away with it. However, the absurdity of this, where a dealership employee goes out and finds the car in traffic and approaches the driver and tells him to get out of the car, and he's armed when he does that, such that it winds up being the guy calls the police because I just got carjacked. And that's what everybody thinks is happening until somebody goes, oh no, I work at the dealership. I was simply repoing the car. No, that's not how this works. That's not how this works. It's not how this works. So Carlos, thanks for sending that. Chris Gothner wrote that for Local 10 out of Miami. He had a good friend who worked there for a little while at that TV station. Miami federal jury convicts dealership employee of carjacking customer after auto pay hiccup. The guy was current when he got carjacked for the repo. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. You don't stop playing because you get old. You get old because you stop playing.